Welcome to Twists of Life, where every story has an unexpected turn. Stories of joy and sorrow, hope and redemption, just like the life we all live. Make yourself comfortable. It's time to begin. Eleanor doted on her son David, seeing him as the chief reward of her life. Her love for him was all-consuming, as if invisible threads of control entangled his every step. Unlike David, her daughter Clara grew up in an atmosphere of icy detachment. Her independence and self-sufficiency paradoxically made her less interesting to her mother, as she didn't require constant care. David, despite his outward success, remained in his mother's eyes a perpetual boy, incapable of surviving without her tireless attention. This was a deep misconception, but no arguments could shake her conviction. Years of trying to break free from his mother's hyper-care proved futile, and David resigned himself, learning to navigate under her constant control. The real difficulties began when David decided to marry. Helen was already the third candidate for the role of daughter-in-law, and the two previous ones had not withstood Eleanor's pressure, preferring to break off the relationship rather than live under her dictate. Helen knew what she was getting into. David had warned her beforehand about his mother's difficult character and their shared living situation. "You don't choose your parents, Dave. I can handle it," Helen replied calmly, showing surprising patience. "She gave life to the man I love, and for that, I'm ready to endure a lot." However, Helen did not yet imagine the true extent of Eleanor's nitpicking. The first meeting with the future mother-in-law was scheduled for Saturday. Helen was very nervous, understanding that her future happiness with David was at stake. She prepared thoroughly, learning about Eleanor's tastes and preferences from her fiancé to make the best possible impression. Helen baked Eleanor's favorite honey cake, dressed up smartly, and waited for David. He arrived with a bouquet of flowers, and together they went to the house that was to become her home as well. Meanwhile, Eleanor was also preparing for the meeting, but her mood was negative from the start. She hadn't seen Helen yet, but she was already sure she wouldn't like the girl, because no one could love and care for her son the way she did. Eleanor met them in the hallway, looking welcoming, even dressed up, with light makeup. However, Helen physically felt the wave of antipathy emanating from her, as if an invisible wall had risen between them. During dinner, Eleanor asked standard questions about family, education, and work. Helen answered calmly and confidently, for she had much to be proud of. Her father was a colonel, her mother a surgeon, and she herself was a successful gastroenterologist. Eleanor was impressed. Helen clearly surpassed David's previous simple girlfriends. She even thought that Helen would be a perfect match, if only she weren't vying for the place next to her son. On the whole, the evening passed without obvious scandals. David drove Helen home, knowing that the most difficult conversation now awaited him. His mother was waiting for him in the living room. Her tense expression did not bode well. David decided to take the initiative, preparing to defend Helen. "Mom, what is it? Wrong again? What did Helen do to displease you?" he asked directly. Eleanor pretended to be surprised, but her eyes revealed calculation. "Why did you decide she displeased me? Quite a nice girl, educated, cultured," she began, but David interrupted. "But there's definitely a but, right?" "Yes, if not for one but. I think she's boring." Eleanor delivered the most ridiculous complaint she could invent. David involuntarily laughed, struck by the absurdity of her words. It was obvious she simply couldn't find another reason to pick a fight. His mother continued, trying to pressure David. "How will you live with her? Have you thought about that?" David walked up to her, took her hands, and replied gently but firmly, "I'll live perfectly well with her, Mum. Stop looking for problems where there are none. Helen is exactly the kind of person you seem to dream of for me." He reminded her of his age and his desire to start a family. Eleanor understood he was right, but the thought of having to share her son was unbearable. Even future grandchildren couldn't stifle this pain, because she only needed David. "You're right, son. It's time for you to get married," she began her usual song, about him being grown up and no longer needing his mother. David was quick to reassure her, promising that their lives wouldn't change drastically. He insisted that having Helen in the house would only make it more cheerful, and she wouldn't be lonely during his business trips. He looked at his mother with such hope that Eleanor couldn't resist. She had never been able to refuse her favorite. "All right, get married. I won't interfere," she finally said. David happily hugged her, calling her the wisest woman in the world. 2 months later, David and Helen got married, and Helen moved into her husband's house. The first few weeks went surprisingly smoothly. Helen couldn't even believe her luck. Eleanor was all kindness, chatting with her daughter-in-law, helping her around the house. But as soon as David left for a week-long business trip, the dam broke. The nitpicking poured out one after another. "You're not ironing right. Not enough salt. Too much salt. You put that in the wrong place. That's David's chair. You can't sit there." Helen didn't understand how a person could change so drastically, but she silently endured, trying to correct all the mistakes. The real nightmare began when Helen brought a kitten home. David had approved the idea, remembering they'd always had cats, and Helen hoped the fluffy little one would soften the atmosphere. But Eleanor met the new resident with hostility. "Why did you bring this flea-ridden thing? I can't stand fur. You're doing this to spite me," she screamed. And that's when Helen couldn't take it anymore. In a calm but firm voice, she asked, "Dear Eleanor, what are you trying to achieve? Our divorce? That won't happen. I discussed the kitten with David, and he said you love cats. It turns out you're ready to deny even that, just because I brought it," Helen continued, looking her mother-in-law directly in the eyes. "The only thing you'll achieve with this attitude is that we'll move into a rented apartment, and you'll be left alone. Does that suit you? I don't think so. Either we live in peace or we leave. And don't count on us breaking up. I'm expecting a baby." Eleanor was taken aback, looking at her daughter-in-law with completely different eyes. "So you have a character after all, girl," she thought with unexpected respect. Aloud she said, "I don't want you to leave. Perhaps I am being difficult, but understand me, I'm a mother. I want my son's happiness." Helen countered, "And you think I came to ruin his life? Have I given you any reason to think that?" Eleanor turned to leave, but then looked at her daughter-in-law again. "All right, let's live in peace, especially since you shouldn't be stressed," she said, as if concluding a truce. After this conversation, her behavior indeed changed. The nitpicking stopped, and she tried to cross paths with Helen less often. Helen noticed how the kitten, named Jasper, became a frequent guest in Eleanor's room, and she held him even more often than Helen herself did. Life in the house gradually improved. The tension subsided. 2 years passed, and Helen and David had a son, whom they named Edward after David's deceased father. Eleanor remembered her husband fondly, while David barely remembered him. Eddie grew, and his grandmother actively participated in his life. She played with him, took him for walks while Helen took care of the house. Outwardly, her attitude towards her daughter-in-law became more even, but the inner antipathy, though silent, was still felt. Life flowed calmly until unforeseen circumstances disrupted its rhythm. David had to go on a long month-long business trip abroad. Helen was very worried, but the trip was necessary. A couple of days after he left, Helen noticed that Eleanor had become withdrawn, silent, and stopped playing with her grandson. Gathering her courage, Helen decided to talk to her. "Eleanor, is something bothering you? Maybe something hurts?" I'm a doctor, Helen asked uncertainly. Her mother-in-law replied that everything was fine, but Helen didn't believe her and started watching. The next day, she accidentally overheard Eleanor on the phone asking someone for support. Helen didn't understand exactly what they were talking about, but the word support was clear. Eleanor was sociable, but she only asked for help from her closest relatives. Helen called David, told him about his mother's strange behavior and the conversation she had overheard. Something is happening with her, and she's not telling me. Please talk to her. Maybe it's health problems? David promised to talk to her and call back. In the evening, he reported that his mother's test results were bad, and the doctor insisted on urgent surgery. David asked Helen to try talking to Eleanor again, show concern, and persuade her to show the test results. Helen agreed, genuinely worried about her mother-in-law. She resolutely entered Eleanor's room. "Eleanor, I know you don't particularly like me, but please let me help you," Helen said. And then something unexpected happened. Her mother-in-law wept bitterly, which greatly frightened Helen. "Is it that bad? Cancer?" Helen asked. "No," her mother-in-law replied through tears. "It's just, I turned to my daughter. She doesn't have time to go to hospitals with me, and my sister is busy with her own affairs, and my friend and her godmother are at the dacha. They say, 'You have children.' It turns out nobody cares about me. And I'm afraid, you understand? Very afraid." Eleanor showed her the test results, explaining that the doctor at the local clinic insisted on urgent surgery, claiming that time had been lost. Helen carefully studied the results and looked at her mother-in-law with surprise. "You went to the local clinic? I don't see anything terrible here, let alone irreparable. I'll call my gynecologist right now, and we'll go for a consultation tomorrow. I'm sure this is a mistake," Helen said confidently. Eleanor looked at her hopefully. "Really?" "Really," Helen confirmed. The next day, they went to the medical center where Helen worked, to her acquaintance, a gynecologist. The doctor, after listening to the complaints and examining the test results, was extremely surprised by the recommendation for surgery. "Eleanor, I assure you, there are no indications for surgery. I will prescribe treatment, and everything will be fine," he said. Eleanor cried again, but this time from relief. The gynecologist, astonished by his colleague's incompetence, asked Helen to look into the situation. When they left the center, Eleanor stopped, took Helen's hand, and said tearfully, "Helen, please forgive me. I was unhappy. I picked on you. And you. You turned out to be the only person who came to my aid." She understood that with someone else, she would have been sent for an unnecessary operation. No one else would have bothered to investigate. "Thank you, my girl. Thank you so much. I promise, I will be the most loving mother-in-law in the world," she said sincerely. Helen also couldn't hold back tears, not expecting such an admission. "It's all right, Eleanor. We are one family. We should help and support each other," Helen replied. Her mother-in-law said thoughtfully, "In life, it's often the opposite. Strangers help, and your own family is too busy." Helen smiled. "Well, then we are the exception to the rule. Let's go home. Eddie is waiting for us with my mother." Suddenly, Eleanor stopped abruptly, looked at her daughter-in-law, and said, "Listen to me and don't interrupt. I want to thank you not just with words. I will transfer my share of the apartment to you, so that you and David always have equality. It's fair." Helen tried to protest, but her mother-in-law interrupted her playfully but sternly. "Now, don't argue with me. On this matter, I will be categorical and strict, as a mother-in-law should be." She smiled and hugged her daughter-in-law tightly.